Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on the History Vibe podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Loren Stuckenbruck and Stephen Nelson. And today we're going to be talking about a topic that is connected to, I believe, related to the Aramaic language specifically. But I'll let Stephen explain more thoroughly what's going on there.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. So I'm Stephen Nelson, for anyone who doesn't know, from Cross Bible. Cross Bible is an online Bible study application where we delve into a lot of topics related to language and textual criticism. And because of my specific interest and focus in textual criticism of the New Testament, we were extremely excited to co-interview Dr. Stuckenbruck with regard to specifically the Aramaic language, because as everybody in the audience is probably very familiar, the New Testament that we have is all in Greek, originally written in Greek, but there is a lot of debate around what we could possibly reconstruct as a kind of Aramaic layer to the sayings of Jesus in particular. The early church that would have consisted of native Aramaic speakers whose writing does not survive. And so we do have various writings that are in a dialect of Aramaic called Syriac. And as a non-specialist, I am sort of aware of the relationship between what would have been sort of first century Palestinian Aramaic and the later sort of Christian dialect, if you will, of Syriac that we have in the New Testament. But I guess I would wrap this up by saying, Jacob has had various guests on the channel who have speculated about different theories of whether or not we can reliably say that the New Testament is 100% originally written in Greek, or whether or not any of it is a translation. And that is sort of one aspect of today's conversation that I'd like to delve into.
All right. Yeah, because I've had some that have come on and they've talked about a Hebrew or Aramaic Matthew in reference to what Papias talks about, or later church fathers refer to as the gospel of the Hebrews, and texts like that. So and so what I'm curious about is that is there a basis, or is there any evidence at all linguistically, or that somebody could make a case at all that there might have been an earlier source or some kind of text that was written in Aramaic that was lost?
Would you like me to respond?
Sure.
Initially? I'm happy to talk a little bit.
Yeah, please. We love your off-the-cuff remarks on that.
It is such a complicated question. That's the first thing to say. And the second thing to say is, as you know, and as many in the audience would know, there are many positions that are taken on this very matter, which are not mildly, but rather strongly held by those who take them. So some think that the Gospels that we have are translations. I don't think we can say that. But what we do have, and this is very clear, there are several issues going on here. One is that the Gospels that we have are in Greek. There's no question about it. And I think anybody who knows anything about the Gospels or even the New Testament will recognize they are in Greek. And in order to read them, we learn Greek. The second thing, however, is to ask, what about Jesus? Jesus probably did not only speak in Greek. if in Greek. So we have a divide between the time of Jesus and the time that the Gospels are written. And this divide has something to do with language. At some point, if Jesus did not always speak in Greek, I don't presume that he didn't at all, but if he didn't only speak in Greek and spoke in other languages, Aramaic especially, or maybe even Hebrew, some of this will have had to have made its way, if those words are preserved, into Greek in some form. So we have that. And then there's the much broader question. Who spoke what language in Judea, Palestine during the first century at Jesus' time? And that's very, very complex. Unfortunately, what we have when many are taking particular positions on this is a kind of wishful thinking. I want Jesus to have spoken Hebrew because he was a Jew and he was a pious Jew. Therefore, by golly, I'm going to make him speak. Those who propound this theory would not admit this, but it's very important ideologically to many that he spoke Greek. Seth Schwartz maybe overstates it when he says they have a Zionist kind of ideology. Then there are others who think, well, it had to have been Aramaic. And they presume Aramaic where possible, because Hebrew supposedly died out as a living language around 400 or in the 4th century before Christ. And that likewise is way overstated, and it becomes wishful thinking. And then there are further people, Stanley Porter would be one of these, who would want to argue that Jesus having spoken in Greek is very important, and the Gospels presume that he spoke in Greek when he is having a conversation with the Samaritan woman, when he's talking with the Hellenists. This is John chapters 4 and 12, respectively, or when he's talking to a Roman centurion. What other language would he have used besides Greek?
Mm-hmm.
So, there are a lot of issues going on here. And I think to speak wholesale about a gospel being translated from, let's say, a Semitic language into Greek is wrong-footed. But that there has been a transfer over time from Jesus speaking a Semitic language into forms that we have in Greek that meet us in the Gospels is likely, if not actually probable.
So I think it would be helpful to look at a few of these examples of. So you're mentioning John 4, right?
Mm-hmm.
What because I will do a little shameless promotion by demonstrating some things in my Bible software, if you don't mind, just to
Sure.
sort of give everybody a sense of what we're talking about. So John 4 here is in parallel right now between the NRSV updated edition, the NIV, and the Greek in parallel, right? So in this particular instance, it's Jesus engaging with the woman, asking, "Give me a drink." And this is the scene that you're saying is most likely in a real life scenario. You don't imagine that Jesus was engaging this woman in Aramaic, for example. She's a Samaritan woman.
Well, yes, that is not my view, actually. This is the view of Stanley Porter,
Okay.
who refers to this and a number of other passages in the Gospels that presume Jesus is speaking within a Greek-speaking context.
Okay.
And this is one that he presumes. There was perhaps more Greek influence in the Samaritan area than we could imagine for Jerusalem in the 1st century. So that might be one way to argue this. But again, we know that there's Samaritan form of Aramaic,
Uh-huh.
and we're not to presume that she couldn't have spoken in this.
Okay, so what about the example in John 3 with Nicodemus, right? That's sort of a famous one. So here you have the reference to Jesus answering, and we get a nice juxtaposition here between the NRSV and the NIV, where the NRSV has Jesus answered him, "Verily, verily, I tell you, no one can see the kingdom of God without being born from above." Right? And the NIV has Jesus replied, "Verily, verily, I tell you, no one can see the kingdom of God unless born again," right? And then we have obviously the reason for this disjunction is the Greek preposition anothen, from above or again, right? Has dual meanings, dual translations.
Mhm.
Can you explain why scholars conclude that this had to have originally been a Greek conversation for the double entendre to work? Because from what I recall, and I think I heard this from Bart Ehrman and other scholars, that this doesn't work in Aramaic.
Right. It doesn't work in Aramaic, and it doesn't work in Hebrew. So I think we are left to decide, is this a historical
Mm-hmm.
conversation that is imagined, that is taking place? And if so, then it must be in Greek. Anothen, one can think again, but then to find one word that underlies anothen in Greek, I'm sorry, in Aramaic or Hebrew is really very, very difficult to reconstruct. Or we simply say this is not historical, and what we have here in the Gospel of John is a term that has a double meaning, hence the different translations that go with it. And I think that works actually much better, but it is under the presumption that what we have here is perhaps a vestige of some kind of conversation that might have taken place, at least in tradition received by John, between Jesus and Nicodemus, but that the Greek text that expresses and presents this conversation is one that is later in the first century and doesn't linguistically go back to a tradition that derives directly from Jesus.
Okay. Jacob, did you want to interject on anything here?
No, not at the moment.
So I have a few, I'd like your feedback on a few things that I have here I have different timelines that are presented on my site that people can explore. One of them is this Bible sort of genealogy of the different sort of textual developments of the New Testament. If you're seeing this for the first time, I'll try to just give you a quick crash course, but basically you have this sort of traditional quote unquote text types, right? Where we have the Alexandrian represented in blue, we have the Byzantine text explosion in red over here. And then we have obviously some of the more dubious groupings, the Caesarean, Byzantine Caesarean mixes for family 1 and 13. And then down here we have the Western text, right? Now, the Western text, as I've shown, does have certain, Syriac Sinaiticus, for example. I would love to get your feedback on kind of what that is. 5th or 6th century palimpsest manuscript. And then, of course, we have the Peshitta, which is colored here in gray because it doesn't actually, it isn't identified as part of the Western text family, but there are some other, the Philoxenian version, the Harklian version. Can you give us insights from your perspective into sort of what's going on here and why it is, like how we get these Syriac versions from the Greek and not the other way around? Like why don't we assume that these are copies of the original Syriac version of the Bible, for example? That's something that we've heard from other people, and it was one of the things we wanted to get your perspective on.
Wasn't it Lamza who famously took the Peshitta as being the Aramaic language that Jesus spoke, and saw therein, it was George Lambza, saw therein the vernacular of Jesus, most best preserved in the Peshitta. So I think the question that I hear you posing, or actually the issue, is if Jesus spoke Aramaic, and if Peshitta, or the Heraclean version, early Syriac versions, are also Aramaic, then would they not have be sources that are very important for bringing us close to the very words of Jesus? I think that's a marvelous question, and it's one that makes a lot of sense at first glance. The problem is that there may be some secondary approximations of Jesus' Aramaic language in these later versions, but they appear to be more translations of the Greek, of Greek sources, of maybe the Greek Vorlage, that's the German for source behind a text that we're looking at, then they seem to be direct takeovers from an original that was composed in the first century.
And
now,
sorry,
yeah,
go
on.
No, go ahead.
The different Greek recensions that you referred to, the Byzantine, of course, what we have in the other colors that you have so nicely showed us, which, by the way, illustrate how complex all of this is.
Yeah.
Really complex. And it's really a minefield to try and to negotiate through these different versions, and even further, more difficult to attach an ideology or a particular tendency along with them, except maybe the Western text, which we have for Acts, and that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But what we have is a largely stable tradition in the Greek, but it is also, by definition, fluid.
Yeah.
And this fluidity makes it very difficult to come down to precise wording at every stage of the transmission, while in remarkable extent, the stability does suggest that we have a tradition that does go back to some kind of original, however, when we would like to imagine it was composed.
Now, if we take a text like the Sermon on the Mount, that has this alliteration and has sort of, it doesn't rhyme, but at least it has sort of traces in it that it appears to be an original Greek composition, right? Literarily. And that sort of, in an example like that, if we don't assume that the author just composed on the spot, that it's carrying over some kind of teaching of the historical Jesus, what we have to assume is that it originated in Aramaic, somehow got captured into Greek in Matthew in this very beautiful form that seems quite native. And then at some point here in the transmission process, in the process of, we have Jerome over here copying it and, translating it into Latin in the 4th century, updating the old Latin versions. And we have translation activity going on it's going from Greek into Syriac, right? So basically we're going from maybe Aramaic or, some kind of a mix. We don't know what language Jesus was giving that sermon in. Then it gets into Matthew. Then it gets into Syriac. Can you kind of describe how you view that process happening?
Yes. And again, I don't want to just throw my hands up and say it's complex and that's the
Yeah.
way it is. Of course not. But yes, there is. I think that in the Sermon on the Mount, for example, and so forth, we have a number of vestiges of Semitic tradition and even language that suggest the sermon, maybe as a whole or in part, at least in part, was not originally Greek, but was taken over from a Semitic language, whether Hebrew or Aramaic.
Hmm.
And I think it's probably Aramaic, but I don't want to preclude Hebrew from being a possibility. And it may be both if one looks at different aspects of this. Okay, so then it is picked up and transmitted in Greek over a period of time with all sorts of scribal idiosyncrasies weighing in on the text here and there. That would be absolutely inevitable. And then it comes to something like the Peshitta in translation. And it may be, especially in liturgical parts, such as the Lord's Prayer, which occurs in chapter 6 of Matthew's Gospel within the literary context of the Sermon on the Mount, that things are restored to a Semitic idiom that we might not have had so easily in the Greek.
Mhm.
Imagine a scribe who is a Syriac scribe or a translator into Syriac who sees the Greek text to the Lord's Prayer and is thinking, well, we say the Lord's Prayer in a certain way, but here is the Greek text. What am I going to do?
Mhm.
There's a choice to be made. Do I simply translate the Greek text, or do I accommodate this prayer to the kind of prayer that we pray liturgically in our worship? I could imagine here that to some extent, maybe a word or two of the Lord's Prayer, for instance, do not allow us to be tempted, instead of do not lead us into
Yeah.
temptation,
Yeah.
would be a great example of how the practiced liturgical prayer context of the later, and possibly also in the earlier Aramaic tradition, is picked up by a translator who is really accommodating the translation to the current practice in the church. In this case, we have to do with secondary Semitization.
Yeah.
And I think this is really important. One of the assumptions that we make, and ever since form criticism, but also much earlier than this, we're all interested in the origins, because the origin is where the meat of everything is at. If we know something about the origins, then we're closer to the truth. So the question of the Semitic background to the Gospels, what underlies the Greek and so forth, is often connected with the ideology of we want to get back to what's early and what is the source, because that somehow brings us more in touch with Jesus and with the dynamic that gets easily lost as time goes on in transmission. However, if we accept the 2 or 4 source hypothesis,
Mhm.
think that Mark is the earliest gospel, and let's say Matthew then adapts Mark and does things with Mark, then what I find very interesting is that in a number of places, oh, thank you, this is
Yeah.
great.
And visual aid. Yes.
Yeah, in a number of places, Matthew casts his tradition about Jesus and from Jesus in language that is more Semitic than Mark. And I find that intriguing. So here, even within the New Testament, we may have to do with a re-Semitizing of a text. In other words, the Semitic character of a Greek does not in every stage have to throw us back to something that's earlier.
Mm-hmm.
It may reflect something that has developed. Many of us know about E.P. Sanders. E.P. Sanders wrote this wonderful, very thought-provoking book, Paul and Palestinian Judaism. But he also, in his dissertation, I think, one of his earliest books was called Tendencies in the Synoptic Tradition. And for me, actually, that book by Sanders is immensely interesting because he draws attention to the Semitizing that goes on in Matthew and or Luke, while holding to this two-source hypothesis. So where, we know that Mark will say, and then, or kai akathen, which in Greek means and from there, or the next step. And
metatata, his pet phrases, right? That he transitions with.
Yeah, kaiuthus and so forth. And Matthew, in equivalent places, let's say Mark does this at chapter 10, verse 1. Matthew in 19, verse 1, in the parallel will have kai agenito.
Mm-hmm.
Kai agenito means and as it happened, or and it came about.
Yeah.
That is very Hebraic. That is not something that it's not impossible in Greek, but it is not something that is as often in Greek as the kind of thing that meets us in the Hebrew Bible and even in many Dead Sea Scrolls. And so if this is the case, and we're still on the level of the Greek, then Matthew is somehow reintroducing a Semitic coloring, his narrative. Randall Booth, who believes that Jesus spoke Hebrew predominantly, also argues that where Matthew uses tauta, which is 80-some times, as opposed to very few in Mark and Luke, tauta is very much a word, the equivalent of which is edion in Aramaic, reflects that Matthew also borrows from Aramaic idioms to tell his narrative as well. So kai agenita from Hebrew, tauta maybe from which reflects edion, which means then in Aramaic, again is a secondary development and is influenced, according to Booth, from Aramaic. And what's interesting in his argument is that's very separate from the question about the language of Jesus, because this is the language of the narrator anyway. So we see we have a lot of things jumping around here, and it's very easy to lose one's footing when chasing down rabbits down no, I don't know how the idiom goes. Chasing,
going down rabbit holes. Yeah,
that's right. So the ideology of going to the origins certainly is fine, and Semitic coloring of Greek, where we can establish that, is suggestive, but it doesn't automatically mean that a Semitic Greek must bring us back to something that's earlier. It could be a secondary development as well. And this probably also happens to some degree within the transmission tradition in the copying of the Greek text.
Now, so I guess what you're describing is a phenomenon where potentially, let's say the author of the Gospel of Mark is a Hellenistic Jew, right? He's somebody from a Jewish community who speaks Greek as a native language, but is very accustomed to reading the Septuagint, to hearing phrases begin with this like ke geneto and kephis, and all of these Semiticisms are simply integrated, embedded in his Greek lexicon already, and therefore when we find them, we can't really tell. Does this mean that he's translating from a Semitic source, or does it just mean he has a Semitic flavor to the way he writes Greek?
Correct. Yeah, that's right. And many who recognize or acknowledge that we have a kind of Semitic Greek taking place here in the Gospels. Luke, for example, chapters 1 and 2 looks a lot like what we would expect to find in Septuagint, is that we're not really dealing with a source, but rather with a kind of imitation of what we find in the Septuagint. Actually, I don't like that hypothesis a great deal, but it makes a lot of sense. It's a lot better than what originally was thought. Originally meaning the 18th, early 19th century, among Hebraists, so to speak, who thought that the Semitic coloring to Greek as appearing in the Gospels was a kind of Jewish dialect of Greek. Jews spoke their own kind of Greek, and therefore they were sequestered and isolated from the surrounding Mediterranean world. Is a way of, it's really an anti-Jewish ideology at work in this. And to say that Luke, for example, or even Matthew, Mark maybe, imitated Greek from Septuagint tradition is, a lot better, and it's less anti-Jewish in that way. And it does recognize that those who wrote the Gospels were very much in touch with the Jewish scriptures. They lived and breathed them and were prone to adopt the kind of language to give their narratives a sacred tone that was appropriate to their telling the story of Jesus.
And so what hypothesis did you specifically refer to that you said you didn't like? Because I wanted to latch onto that and clarify.
Well, one that I really don't like is certainly the view that the Semitic coloring of Greek, to the extent that we can establish this, is a kind of Jewish Greek dialect. I don't like that.
Okay.
And also don't like simply throwing one's hands up and saying, well, obviously we have an imitation of Septuagint. These generalizations really function more as wishful thinking. Once we have found a couple of instances, we think, or one might think that, oh, this is just the way it is. And unfortunately, really for each of the theories that engage with this problem in the synoptic and tradition and John, run into problems once they try to push the theory to cover more material. Life is always a lot more complex than what we think it is, or that we want it to be, and it's best to be as open-minded as possible.
Well, Jacob, I don't want to totally hijack the interview. If you had anything that if you have a list, if you have anything you need to cover, it would be very rude of me to completely commandeer this, but I'm ready to if you want me to take over, because I have other rabbit holes.
Well, before we do, I guess I'll ask real quick.
Yeah.
Loren, you were just saying that things can be a bit more complicated and nuanced
Mhm.
And to that end, I wanted to ask about what you make about early sources like from Papias talking about a Matthew that was written in the Hebrew dialect, and he's not claiming from what we can tell from his fragments. Uh, he's not claiming that our Matthew was a translation. He's just saying it's a different text.
Correct.
Uh, what do you make of that?
Well, it's a wonderful question. I mean, there are people who would want to say that we should just take this tradition, which Irenaeus picks up and so forth, at his word. And this is just the way it is. We have, though, a lot of instances of views in antiquity about the Gospels, which, in order to gain credibility, then are attributed to authoritative sources. For instance, third Corinthians, a letter that Paul never wrote, um, was claimed to have been written by Paul. It's not in our New Testament. And the attribution to Paul, however, by someone along the way, was meant to give credibility to that particular theory. So that's how I read the Papias tradition. At some point, the Semitic flavor of Matthew's gospel was understood not as a secondary development, which is something I've just suggested might have been the case,
Mhm.
but as something that goes back to an original source. And in order to give credibility to this theory, it was attributed to an oral tradition that is said to have come from Papias, who himself then has an earlier source of information that then strengthens the reliability of this theory.
Now, when Papias says Matthew collected the oracles or the logia, right, the logia, in the Hebrew language, and he uses the term Evraiki or Evraisti, and then each interpreted them as best he could. That's the Eusebius quote of Papias.
Mhm.
What is your opinion on what language he is actually referring to, but with the name Hebrew?
Okay,
Does he mean Aramaic, but he's calling it Hebrew?
right. Well, this is a much debated point. Um, if we're to trust the Bible and if we're to trust the Gospels when they say Hebrew, or even Acts when Paul is speaking in a Hebrew dialect,
Yeah.
uh, this must be Hebrew if this is reliable at all. Otherwise, it's telling falsely. And Josephus is able to say something about the not only Hebrew dialect, but I think something about Syriac. So this distinction, if it works in Josephus or other sources, then this distinction must be operative in the background of the sources that we have. So John, for example, I think in Bethsaida, the reference to the pool of Bethsaida in John chapter 5, I would argue that Bethsaida, with the final A, would be an emphatic Aramaic, meaning the, so the house of the hunter or so could be understood that way. But then John, in the narrative, says this is in Hebrew. And we have a similar thing with the Golgotha, I think in chapter 19. Now, Golgotha is very clearly an Aramaic word. It's Golgotha, but the second L is, caught up into the sound, so that we have a Golgotha. Again, the final A, meaning skull place, the skull place, which everybody knows. And then in John's Gospel, makes it very clear that this is Hebrew. So what are we to say? Well, Hebrew, but an Aramaic word. Some would say, well, this has to be Hebrew, and we're going to make it such. Or maybe, as you say, there's an Aramaic word that is then simply called Hebrew, but they're wrong. I wouldn't want to say either. I think I would want to simply say that the distinction between Hebrew and Aramaic in such instances, and I think John is a better example than Papias because it's all much later from the time that we're concerned with, that this distinction between Hebrew and Aramaic was really not so important to the author.
So the text we're referring to here, John 19:17. So the tension you see here is between the NRSV's translation of Hebrew and then the NIV putting in parentheses, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. The NIV is taking a liberty here and translating the word Evraisti into Aramaic, where the NRSV is keeping it as Hebrew, and they're just giving you a note.
That's right. I think the NRSV is correct. This liberty to say that it is Aramaic is wrong. But the real question is whether this distinction was an important one in the writer's mind. I mean, I don't know what the writer's thinking in his mind, but whether it is an important one to make in this particular context. Now, I'm not so sure.
I don't, if I recall, I mean, I wish I had, if I were better prepared, I'd have the list of examples and I would be looking them all up. But, there's the reference you referred to in the book of Acts. There are lots of places in the New Testament that refer to Hebrew that when you look in the commentaries, the scholarship is like, this probably is like referring to Aramaic. If I recall, the Septuagint does make distinctions between Hebrew and Aramaic. And it doesn't conflate them, whereas the New Testament just seems to call everything Hebrew.
Yes, that's true. Of course, I think there are different reasons for distinguishing between the use of one language and another. So, of course, in Ezra and in other parts of the Septuagint, and in the Hebrew Bible, I'm sorry. The distinction is very clear. It doesn't mean it has to carry over into every particular context. For instance, what I've just argued in relation to John may not, in fact, carry over into Acts. Acts, Paul is speaking in a Hebrew dialect when he is, speaking in front of other people. I think we've got that. Let's see, it's later on in Acts.
Well, so we have in Acts chapter 6 is when this interesting term Hellenists pop up, right?
Well, true. Okay, I'm thinking of Acts chapter 21 and 22, 26 maybe. He speaks in a Hebrew dialect.
Okay.
And in this case, I think we are to take Acts at its word. He's actually speaking Hebrew.
He addressed them in the Hebrew language, saying, and then again, the NIV is saying, this isn't Hebrew, this is Aramaic. And meanwhile, the Greek is saying, the Evraidi.
No, I think this is, he's probably speaking in Hebrew. And it may be that in this case, we have to do with him speaking because it's with the claim that he is speaking in Hebrew because Paul doesn't usually speak in Hebrew.
So would you see Paul as trilingual, like as somebody who's probably spoke Greek natively, Aramaic, Hebrew, all three, right?
Sure. I would think so, and I think the same could be said about Jesus. Although these are the reasons for using one language or another are something to explore. And now, the use of this is why looking at the linguistic context of Judea-Palestine is so significant to distinguish between functions. This argument, I mean, okay, so we have also in Acts the field of blood, a keldama, which is very clearly Aramaic. It's not Hebrew or anything else. It has to be Aramaic. And it, of course, also occurs in Matthew. Here, we're not talking, though, about Jesus' words. We're talking about the narrator who is referring to this common tradition that must have been in Aramaic.
And what do you think is going on here in Acts 6:1, where it says, now during those days when the disciples were increasing in number, the Hellenists complained against the Hebrews because their widows were being neglected in the daily distribution of food. I know this is a loaded topic,
good.
and yeah, but I mean, so we have these two parties. We have Hellenists and we have Hebrews, Evrei. And is this a sort of, I can say that in commentaries like Purvo's commentary on Acts, right? The Hellenists he says the Hellenists are contrasted against the Hebrews, and that's the contextual clue that we have, that it's distinguishing native Hebrew-speaking Judahites from Greek-speaking diaspora Jews. But Paul is a Greek-speaking diaspora Jew and labels himself the Hebrew of Hebrews in Philippians 3:5. So how do we distinguish between cultural context, linguistic context, ethnic labels here?
We don't clearly distinguish between them. We want to, but we can't. There is a distinction. They're obviously different groups. And the fact that they are different groups gives us the point of departure. The point of departure is that they are culturally different and distinguishable. Whether these are actually descriptive of the language that they primarily speak, that's possible, if not plausible, but it doesn't preclude that the so-called Hellenists couldn't speak a word of Hebrew or Aramaic, and it doesn't preclude that the Hebrews couldn't speak any Greek or even Aramaic. I think it's both, and it's where the emphasis lies. So I would see this as social or sociological, the related descriptions and labels that say more about cultural diversity and conflict than they say strictly about language, though language obviously plays into it. It's just that these can't be just substituted for one another.
And would you say the same comes in 9:29, where he spoke and argued with Hellenists? And then you could see that the NIV goes Hellenistic Jews here, right? This sort of interesting term that kind of pops up in the New Testament a lot. And it's like, who are these people? Who is he debating?
Yes, that's right. And what's interesting is that the Hellenists aren't culturally, in this particular chapter, they're not culturally more open-minded than anyone else, than traditionalists who are speaking Aramaic or Hebrew as such. They're the ones who are really offended by Stephen's insinuation that the temple is, not all it's cracked up to be. So they come across as traditionalists, which is not something one quite would expect if we're dealing with a broader cultural context that is simply to be understood under the label of Hellenist.
And I think the other instance here is in 11:20 as well. But among them were some men of Cyprus and Cyrene who, on coming to Antioch, spoke to the Hellenists. And then here we get spoke to the Greeks in the NIV, proclaiming Jesus Lord. And I believe there's also some textual variation here. You can see the bracket in the SBL where this says Hellenists. But I think if you check the apparatus, it actually in some cases it just gets rendered as Greeks, the the Hellenes, not the Hellenists in verse 20.
It's just wonderful to see how you're throwing these texts up like that. That's wonderful. Great for the viewers, and very good to stay focused on the text here.
Yeah, this is the SBL apparatus pings it, so it does say. So we have Westcott, Hort, and Tregelles, and the NA28. Give it this the reading of Hellenists, and then we see other primary reading Hellenists, and then the Hellenes is in Tregelles, and the NIV gives it makes it Greeks basically. It's a question of did the original autograph, like did the original author use the term Greek or use the term Hellenists, and we just don't quite know.
Right. Yes. And just going back to some of the examples, Aramaic and Greek, Aramaic and Hebrew share so many linguistic qualities, even though they are separate and distinguishable Semitic languages. They still share so many features that it is sometimes, as well as vocabulary, that it is sometimes very difficult to distinguish whether something behind the Greek text is Hebrew or it is Aramaic. And even when Jesus says, "Be opened," as you know, I think this is Mark chapter 7:34 or something like that. He says, "Ephatha," to the blind man. That's right. 7:34, I think.
Yeah, let me jump to it.
My memory's playing tricks on me, but chapter 7, verse 34, Mark. Oh, good.
Yeah. So 34. Sorry, we got the Greek here. Let me just add another version. I think I closed my comparison. So I'll put the NRSV on the top, and I will let's go from Beza to the SBL. Sorry, give me a second.
Good.
3, and then what was your 34?
Yeah, 34. I think
right.
it's 30. Unless my mind is playing tricks on me.
Ephatha, be opened.
Right, be opened. Now, pathach or patach in Hebrew and in Aramaic is the same root. And it could either be itpa'ach in Aramaic, or it could be itpa'ach, which is a nifal form of Hebrew, and it would work. The transliteration here would work in both languages. So the Aramaists, those who really went after this, like Matthew Black, but especially Arnold Meyer, Dahlman, and so forth, earlier in the 20th century, simply argued that this had to be Aramaic because Jesus spoke Aramaic. Birkeland, Carmagnac, and many others have argued, no, look, this could be Hebrew. And it must be Hebrew because obviously Jesus is a pious Jew, and this is what pious Jews could have spoken at the time. However, in chapter 5, we have Talitha Kum. If we go to an early, I'm sorry, that's chapter 5. What would it be? 21? No, 41. 41, I think.
41. There we go.
Is that it?
Talitha Kum.
Yes. Little girl, get up. Now, in proper Aramaic, it would be Talitha Kumi, and of course, this is also reflected in the manuscript tradition here and there, I think. But what is interesting is that the accent being on kum so much does result in the I at the end falling out. The I makes it a feminine. Speaking, get it. So we have kum here, which is really wonderful because He's not speaking to a boy, he's speaking to a girl, but um, uh, colloquially, cum, with the stress on the first syllable, would easily have left out the second one. So we have cum. In either case, however, talitha especially, with the a end, meaning the little girl, indicates this is Aramaic, and it is not Hebrew at all.
Now, what the textual apparatus here is suggesting is that the Robinson-Pierpont edition of the the Byzantine text, the majority text form, is where we find kumi.
Yeah.
And I'm so that's basically the the received text. And actually, I'm going to test this theory. If you open up, let's see what the Beza has, right? So Beza has cum, right? If I look for Elsevier, let's see what Elsevier has. This is a critical edition, so it might tell me, oh, cum. So Elsevier has kumi. So we get basically the received text, the Textus Receptus that is underlying the King James, that was super, was the standard text up until the 19th century when it got overhauled, overthrown. Now we've reverted back to cum as the more likely original. Can you explain, because this is something that would have just been totally over my head without you here to explain it. Why is it that in the received text tradition that where we had this explosion of these red manuscripts, in the basically everything you see here in red is kumi. Sure. Everything you see down here is cum. That's what I'm going to assume. If you could look on, if you had a crystal ball and you could just get the readings here, it would be cum, and then kumi here. What's going on there? Just to clarify.
Going back to an earlier bit of our conversation today, I think we have in this case evidence for re-Semitization. A re-Semitizing of the text.
Interesting.
That imagines what really it would have been and is. Now, in the Syriac, there are a number of final vowels that are just simply not pronounced. There are no vowels attached to them. So now, off the top of my head, I don't know what the Peshitta, how it spells it. I would imagine we have kumi, but there's only a vowel for the cum and not for the e. That suggests it has to be pronounced at all costs. But that it is there formally suggests that we easily can restore that. Whether in the Greek, of course, here I'm talking about the Syriac, but that anyone who knew this context at all or had familiarity could have restored the E. I see this as a secondary Semitizing of the tradition rather than something that goes to the original that then was lost. Okay. Because we know that these feminine imperatives, which we would then, call, were already at this time being curtailed due to where the emphasis lies in the word.
Okay, well, I'll ping Jacob one more time. First of all, thank you so much. I think sometimes when you explain things, you're touching your microphone with I think your right hand may be grazing your microphone. It creates a little noise. But it was fine. We could hear you pretty clearly. Jacob, I have I have a rabbit trail I want to go down, but I want to make sure to loop you in first in case there was anything you were wanting to say before I distract us.
So basically what you're saying is that I think what you're saying is the possibility that there was a lost Hebrew text can't be completely ruled out. While at the same time, the idea that any of our New Testament texts is translated from Hebrew or Aramaic isn't really strong, but nonetheless, there is evidence of Semitic influence, Semitisms, curious Semitisms that are present.
Correct. To use the metaphor, music metaphor, I don't think we are dealing with a Semitic tradition in legato. In other words, with a running translation, a translation of a running text, so much as in staccato. If you know music, staccato is here, 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 here. It's dots. And whether these dots connect up within a running Vorlage is impossible to say. But that we have these dots that are indicative that the language context of Jesus is not the same as the communicating language context of the Gospels is, I think, really important.
All right. Well, I wanted to get your feedback on something I put together that I'm not sure if you're familiar with an author named Gilad Zuckerman, but he's a linguist who has done some work on, he does language reconstruction. And he helped me build this sort of timeline of Hebrew that I would love your feedback on. So the top of the timeline, similar to the timeline of the Bible, this just goes a lot further, right? Shows that, in the 15th, 14th, 13th century BC, we have, sort of the hypothetical proto-Hebrew period where Hebrew was starting to really distinguish itself from the Canaanite language, right? And the earliest archaeological finds we have in the 12th and 11th century BC are written, the Ophel Pithos and the Zaid stone. As far as I'm aware, scholars and archaeologists haven't quite determined, they can't quite pin down whether or not these should be identified as Hebrew inscriptions, Canaanite inscriptions, in some case, maybe Phoenician inscriptions. It's just too early in the process to tell, right? Is this Canaanite? Is it Hebrew? Is this Canaanite? That's why I have question marks all over these. And then we have, the Aharim sarcophagus, which is identified as Phoenician, but the smoke clears in this sort of Paleo Hebrew script period, right? Where the Paleo Hebrew script is developed. This is like 9th, 8th, 7th centuries BC, which would be the sort of First Temple monarchic period in history, where archaic biblical Hebrew is really kind of taking shape, right? Up until the exile, when the Aramaic square script comes into play, right? We actually have verifiable bona fide Hebrew inscriptions, the Samaria Ostraca Siloam inscription, and the Lachish Ostraca, is that correct? And then Shebna inscription, and then Old Aramaic at the exact same time, the Mesha stele, the Teldan stele, right? I don't know if I've really nailed this. These are all kind of approximations, right? And then we have soon after that in the Persian period, the Elephantine papyri, which is mostly in Aramaic. But for people who may not quite wrap their heads around what I have here, can you kind of explain what's going on with Hebrew and Aramaic as these sort of sister languages in these periods, and pre-exilic, exilic, post-exilic?
It's difficult to say, of course, and there are different theories about the matter. I'm not a real expert in the old Canaanite time, though I did study this some time ago. The crucial thing is, of course, what happens when a shift takes place in the written Hebrew. When the Aramaic script is adopted for representing the Hebrew language. Now, significantly in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are still a number of there are some manuscripts and then some words, for instance, for God in manuscripts that go back and pick up the Paleo Hebrew, so that there is an awareness that Hebrew was originally being written in another script that persists into the 2nd and 1st centuries BC. which is, I think, fascinating. And they could draw on this at will. Even coinage does this. Jerusalem the Holy draws on the ancient Paleo, the Paleo Hebrew script at that stage. But unfortunately, this shift to the use of Aramaic script to represent Hebrew led Klaus Bayer, who was my teacher, by the way, to argue that Hebrew died out as a living language
In this period here?
in around 400.
Oh wow, BC.
Yes, and he was an amazing linguist, absolutely amazing. He knew his Hebrew, he knew his Arabic and so forth, but he made this claim and then imagines that when Hebrew is used to such a large degree, 7/8 of the manuscripts of the Dead Sea Scrolls are in Hebrew, that it is only used not because it's a living language generally, but it's only used because those who are writing it are particularly pious. They're priests. They're high-end elite.
They're using a liturgical language, basically.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they think of it as religious. But outside this context, Hebrew was dead.
Now, the assumption that undergirds this timeline that, like I said, Dr. Zuckerman was instrumental in helping me sort of compile, is that during this period when we find these inscriptions, and during this period where, at least in the minimalist dating of the Hebrew Bible, when it's taking its final form in the Persian and then Hellenistic period, that he assumes, and I think a lot of scholars assume, maybe this is mainstream consensus, that Hebrew was still spoken, that it was a spoken language. It hadn't yet fallen back into a status of liturgical language or quote unquote dead language or dormant language until much later. And in his dating schema, basically he dates the sort of late biblical Hebrew period where it's still spoken, but it's being codified in the Bible in this elevated form and with archaisms. He sees the Bar Kokhba revolt as one of the events that coincides in the Roman period with this sort of, you can see the color scheme kind of tapers off a little bit, right? Where you get basically 1st century, 2nd century, my dating block is gone here, but you get basically 1st, 2nd, by the 3rd century BC, AD, Common Era. He believes that basically the Mishnah and the Tosefta and the Talmud, that by the time you get the Talmud's composition, that the Talmud is effectively, in the Aramaic Targums, this is effectively a reaction to a historical circumstance where Hebrew is dying. Like it is no longer spoken as the native language of the majority of the Jewish population and especially in the diaspora, and that this is effectively a preservation tactic of like, okay, we're all good with Aramaic. Let's go ahead and just start adding commentary on the Hebrew Bible in Aramaic, because Aramaic, because Hebrew is sort of getting it's still there. It's an elevated liturgical language. Do you agree with this schema, or do you think it's do you think it's more nuance or something that I'm not quite pinning down here?
I think Zuckerman is probably right. I think he is. He sees here that in the Mishnaic Hebrew we have a response that is a concern to preserve sacred tradition, and it codifies itself in a kind of poetic, especially in the Mishnah, a kind of poetic Hebrew that is beautiful. It's a beautiful work of art as such. However, I'm not sure that's the entire picture, because in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which I'm more familiar with, really, what is significant before is that we have a number of forms coming into certain documents which anticipate the kind of Hebrew that meets us in the Mishnah.
So you're referring to like Qumran Hebrew?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Dead Sea Scrolls, I would say. I don't like Qumran, the word.
Okay.
It's It's an anachronistic term that describes that. But yes, amongst the 11 caves, cave 3, of course, the treasure, the copper scroll, and in even some earlier Hebrew documents like 4QMMT and so forth, we have the use of certain words that we wouldn't expect to be there if they're modeled, if the texts are modeled on classical Hebrew in the Hebrew Bible, but which are already anticipating what then we get in the Mishnah. For example, instead of asher, which is a relative pronoun or so forth, we have she, which of course is used today in modern Hebrew to mean the same thing. So what we have in the Mishnah is the result of a living process of language development that suggests really the spoken Hebrew did not die entirely from, let's say, 400. If we're going to take that particular date from Kospire, or sometime in the 4th century, or even in the 1st century. But forms here were already coming into play that would then easily hand over to the kind of language that meets us then in the codification of oral tradition in the Mishnah.
Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls here in this date range, if we're assuming that these were compositions that range from the 2nd century, 3rd century, 2nd century BC into like the 1st century AD, this does coincide with that final sort of phase of spoken Hebrew where it's still alive and kicking, right?
I guess it should, and I think that would be also what Zuckerman is acknowledging as well.
This is the handoff, basically. You're going from Dead Sea Scrolls, the final, the last hurrah, where Hebrew is still spoken. It's a native language. They're composing in it. They're very, very fluent. And then you hand over into the Mishnaic Hebrew period, where now we have the Jewish Talmud. And just so we're clear, sorry, go ahead.
No, at the Bar Kokhba revolt.
Yeah.
It's a very important point. And of course, we have letters from the caves, from Nahal Heber, for example, that are composed in Hebrew at that point. Now, some think it's because this is a really special time, of resistance, and therefore Hebrew then becomes more important than it would have been otherwise. But another way to argue is that Simon ben Kosovo, receives, writes, Bar Kokhba writes a letter, and it's in Hebrew. Hebrew is out there. It can be used, and it hasn't died even, at this point. So I think there are little links that suggest Hebrew really didn't die. It might have been on a down hill slope in general use, but it does hand over to Mishnaic. And I don't know, we can't really say how much Hebrew women, for instance, would have been able to speak during the late 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries as these traditions are being codified. I assume that Aramaic was more of the language, which we find also in synagogues in the Middle East. But certainly, I don't think Hebrew died out, even as a living language.
Now, I could guarantee you that by the time we get to this point in the video, people have already dropped comments on YouTube criticizing the insinuation that Hebrew quote unquote died out, because there is a really big stigma attached to the word death and die, and we refer to language death, and I could define it for us here, and then maybe you could add clarification. That when we refer to language death, especially in the case of Hebrew, I would say that the collaborator that I had on this timeline, Dr. Zuckerman, he prefers the term dormancy, right? So he says that Hebrew became in this period where he cuts off the end of the spoken Hebrew right here, right? He says that this is when it went dormant, and he does not like the stigma attached to the word death, or to say that Hebrew died out, because you have the rabbinical tradition, you have the Zagot, the Tanaim, the people who are carrying on the tradition of Mishnaic Hebrew, Rabbi Akiva, all of the rabbis in the Mishnaic period, Amoraim, Savoraim, all of these people are all commanding Hebrew. They're all carrying on this tradition. And what we mean when we say that Hebrew died out, and I'll let you take over after this, is not that these people didn't exist and that they didn't know Hebrew or didn't use Hebrew. What we mean is that this, for them, was not their native language. This was a holy language. This was a liturgical language. And it survived in that form, as opposed to just sort of the daily, hey, I'm going to go to the grocery store and speak Hebrew with the person selling me my groceries, right? Like that's the distinction when we're talking about language death. I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
This is wonderful. I would agree. I think the metaphor of death is inappropriate. I think I'm drawing on it because my teacher actually made the claim that it died out as a living language, and so we have this binary die and then living, which is certainly misleading. I like the term dormancy, as long as dormancy doesn't mean non-existing, and it doesn't sound like that would be Zuckerman's claim or your claim, even in this chart.
Yeah, because basically the idea, and because the people who have pushed back, what I've seen online of people who hate this term is that if the Masoretic text is being compiled and put into its final form and vocalized and punctuated by these by the Masoretes from the 7th century to the 10th century, resulting in the Leningrad Codex, the culmination, the final form of the Hebrew Bible that we have today in all of its glory. These people obviously had a command of Hebrew, so it's like, how can you say that it was dead? That's that's where the term dead just doesn't seem to fit, because how it just it's a contradiction in terms.
Good. That's an important point. And if comments are made to that effect, more power to them.
So here we have in the timeline medieval Hebrew, right? We have the Jewish Golden Age in Spain, the sort of revival periods, right? The medieval European period. This is all sort of periodization of Hebrew, leading to the Golden Age in Poland, and then the early modern Hebrew period, when you get already, once you hit 1900, the Jewish Enlightenment, Haskalah, Hebrew revival, and now spoken Hebrew. Arisen from the grave, in that analogy.
Or from lying down.
Yeah, just sort of, it went from its dormant state into the revival period, right? Where here you have people who are using it as a liturgical language, not natively, and then of course you have Ben Yehuda, who famously performed systematic child abuse on his children to force them to speak Hebrew as their native language, and in effect reviving the language as a spoken language.
Yes, and if you add Yiddish to the mix, then it's really interesting. The Book of Tobit is a fascinating case in point, especially in the medieval period. From Geniza on, we have both a number of Hebrew texts to the Book of Tobit, and we have Aramaic texts as well, and they're all circulating in Europe mostly, maybe Egypt, of course, the Geniza, but at different places, and these are concurrent, and they certainly, if we could trace them back to the communities in which they were generated, it would be fascinating to see what kind of linguistic contexts those communities embody. Unfortunately, we don't have that kind of access, but it's fascinating to see same books being concurrently concurrently transmitted, as is the Hebrew Bible with Targums. Our latest Targum, the Neophiti, is 1505, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, these are the ones that I have here documented, right? So I have Onkelos, Jonathan, Neophiti,
right.
and then I don't know, maybe I think that's pretty
And
comprehensive.
the manuscript of Neophiti was claimed to be pre-Christian by Kale and and others, but the manuscript itself is the early 16th century.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, so the date range I have here is 2nd century AD to about 4th century AD, where these Targums were really compiled alongside the Talmud.
Yeah, that's right. Neophiti, who knows? It's hard to say. There was a big controversy about the dating of Targumic tradition. And here, the distinction between the language and the traditions that the Targums hold for their relevance, let's say even to the New Testament, is a very important distinction to make. The Aramaic they have may not be 1st century, but that doesn't preclude that traditions they contain reflect traditions that were in circulation during the early stages of Christianity.
Now, in the Semitic language sort of family, where you have all of these languages, I think there was one, the sort of genealogy here was the one that I wanted to, I don't know if this is the best genealogy to illustrate it, where we have the breaking off into, we have classical Aramaic here. And this is actually probably isn't as comprehensive as the one that's lower down in the article. Let me just I don't want to give everybody a whiplash scrolling through this, but there's okay, here we go. Yeah, so it's the Semitic Semitic language family tree, right? We have the West Semitic, and here's where we break off, right? We break off Northwest Semitic, Aramaic over here. Probably we'll find Hebrew down. We have Canaanite here, right? And we have we have distinct groups with biblical Hebrew being down here, Mishnaic, medieval, and so on. But then up here, these are the we have the Western Aramaic dialect group, Eastern, Western and Eastern continuum, dialect continuum, great term. And then here we have classical Syriac emerging out of this Eastern Middle Aramaic, biblical Imperial Aramaic up here. Could you help us mentally navigate this?
Yes, it's not an easy chart, but it's helpful. It's helpful. The overriding theory is that the lingua franca, that is the language that was most commonly used and established itself in the Near East under the Achaemenid Persian Empire, was Aramaic. And this is why the Aramaic that is associated with that period in inscriptions is called Imperial Aramaic. Imperial, sometimes it's called standard. It could be, anything. And it was a kind of formal Aramaic that we see in inscriptions that were politically motivated or charged, which very quickly became was translated into which transferred into legal language, and of course was spoken as well. Now, then the Eastern Aramaic is what we have then in what leads to the Syriac, and the Syriac sources that we have are the earliest late in 2nd century AD, the Edessa and so forth, leading up to what we have in the Peshitta. That's the one side and kind of Eastern dialect, and with particular forms that relate to it. And then we have a Western breakoff, which you have down in the chart, Western Aramaic. And it's really important in this scheme to see the, at least here represented, the difference between Eastern and Western, and then thinking about the Peshitta in an Eastern dialect, presumably transmitting what we find in, let's say, Palestine, Judea, which would have been a Western Aramaic dialect. So the continuity of this is a potential problem in that respect. But in the Western dialects, we have then emerging the Nabatean, we have Palmyrene, we have others, Palestinian Aramaic, and those who have tried to focus on the significance of Aramaic for the first century have really focused on the Western Aramaic dialects, which then would include, of course, Qumran, or the Dead Sea Scrolls, which we don't have enough represented here in the text. It's something like Biblical Aramaic, but it's a little bit beyond that. Fitzmyer called it Middle Aramaic, or where dialects are beginning to emerge.
Now, with somebody with your particular emphasis academically and your focus, in your studies and your scholarship, do you bridge the Western and Eastern branches pretty easily in terms of your ability to interpret the text? And because the claims that Jacob and I have been interested in is the idea that scholars of classical Syriac who specialize, who are sort of trained to interpret the Peshitta and translate the Peshitta, that they are just clueless when it comes to Western Aramaic and specifically the Galilean dialect, that they're somehow handicapped because their focus is on the Eastern dialect continuum and not the Western. What is reality in that world?
I mean, I think there is a big gulf. Unfortunately, the gulf is such that those who are involved in Western Aramaic, one dialect or another, are frequently not as clued up on Syriac, the later Syriac literature especially, as those who are Syriacologists and specialists in Syriac are in Western Aramaic. And I've thought a lot about this. What are the continuities of Aramaic generally? One claim I tried to make it at one point was, well, we can't be absolutely certain, but though that vocabulary, which we find in Old Aramaic into Imperial Aramaic, and that vocabulary that we find in later Syriac and in the later Rabbinic and literature, is vocabulary that would have been used in the first century because it's a common denominator of these different dialects.
And just to clarify, Jesus would have spoken this Galilean dialect?
I would, the Galilean dialect that we have in front of us in texts really comes from a rabbinic literature, where claims are occasionally made about differences in dialect between Judea on the one hand and Galilee on the other. So there are claims made in the later manuscripts, but what we have is a Galilean, a dialect from a later period. The question is, to what extent can we impute that on a time that is 400 or 500 years earlier? And that's one of the problems that we have had. Gustav Dahlmann and others, who, and as well as the Targum people, Kala and Alejandro Diaz Macho and so forth, and even McNamara, have Chilton, perhaps even to some extent, want to make the Targumic kind of Aramaic, which meets us in later literature, to be a codification of what was a living language during the first century. Now, they know it's more complicated than that, but that is the framework that then guides the research within which they are engaged.
So what dialects are these written in, these targums?
Well, this is interesting. Targum Onkelos may be a slightly Eastern dialect. Targum Jonathan may be more West. Targum Neophiti more West. Targum Yerushalmi, the same. So even here we have somewhat of a distinction. The problem is we're dealing mostly in Targum Onkelos with a translationese Aramaic.
Okay.
And the orality or the dynamic form of the language meets us where the Targum is actually elaborating on the Hebrew text rather than simply translating it. So it's those parts of the Targums that are particularly interesting for thinking about, I'm going to say living, but don't take it in a binary way, a dynamic language that is spoken. There is something to this because, when we look at language in its written form, when we imagine the orality of the language behind it, usually we have an oral language that then later becomes codified. The written language that we have isn't always equal or doesn't always match up to the concurrent form of the spoken language.
Now,
the written is up later. So Fitzmyer, then against the Targum people, insisted we've got to go with contemporary written Aramaic in order to think about the Aramaic of Jesus or the Aramaic of the Gospels. And so he appeals, of course, to all these wonderful texts that we have in Aramaic in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And unfortunately, or fortunately, whatever, what we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls is written Aramaic that probably reflects a spoken Aramaic from a slightly previous period.
And would that be the Western? That would be sort of Jewish. Okay.
Yeah,
so
right.
when like we're going through Wikipedia here right now, right? So Jewish Palestinian Aramaic in the Western variety, that is what we find featured in some of these Aramaic targums, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then if we back up, we see that is opposed to the branch that is Christian Palestinian Aramaic, right? Yeah. And that is witnessed down here.
Yes.
Okay, so this is where we find like Syriac Sinaiticus, right? The Harklian versions, the Peshitta. This is all going to be examples of Christian Aramaic, Christian Syriac, right?
Certainly that's Christian Syriac. Now, Christian Palestinian Aramaic would also have a Western side to it, but of course it's so much later that it is hardly relevant for thinking about the first century. Schultes made a great deal out of, in the early 20th century, out of Christian Palestinian Aramaic sources. And Kala and the Targum's approach, complained that it wasn't Western enough.
So when they're shown sort of on the same line here, you're saying that technically Christian Palestinian Aramaic is much later than Jewish Palestinian Aramaic in terms of historical development?
It's not later, and I wouldn't say it's dependent on, it's just a different development. And it's a different development that has more Eastern influences, like maybe even Targum Onkelos is imagined to be also a kind of Babylonian context, which then would be, easily Eastern and not simply Western.
Yeah.
Of Eastern and Western we see just in this conversation is a bit misleading because the dialects bleed into one another. From this chart, I just want to point out one thing. We have Palmyrene under the Western, Palmyrene Aramaic. We have Nabatean Aramaic, Palmyrene Aramaic. Our sources come from the 1st century BC until, largely towards the end of the 3rd century AD. But what I wanted to say about that, beautiful, great, is that we have well over 200 inscriptions that are bilingual, and bilingual in Greek and in Palmyrene Aramaic, and they correspond to one another. And to me, this is a great way of seeing how language comes into contact in a contemporary way, rather than here's a phase and then here's another phase. So I think that looking at these bilingual texts in Palmyra, and some of them are rather long, many of them are dated, would be one way of seeing how language actually comes into contact, and that it does so not simply by taking a Vorlage and then translating it, 20 or 30 years later, but
And
showing
define Vorlage for people who might not remember when we defined it.
Vorlage is a source behind text that we're looking at, which is either in the same language or in another language if we're dealing with the translation. So throwing the Palmyrene Aramaic into the mix is just a great way of illustrating how languages in contemporary use by different users are interacting with one another while retaining their own particular idioms. I just wanted to put that out there, because we can go simply to the Septuagint for patterns of how terms were translated from Hebrew into Greek. But here we actually have, in addition to Daniel, where we have Greek translating Aramaic, we have here Aramaic and Greek really contemporary to one another in their generated forms.
Now, I think for the final phase of this, and I'll punt to Jacob, because Jacob spent a lot of time interviewing a scholar named Dr. Odlin regarding his interesting theories about a potential underlying Aramaic source behind the Gospel of John. And you don't have to address anything you're not comfortable addressing if you're not familiar with this scholarship. But the thing that I found interesting was that he said that he and another, I guess, autodidact named Steve Caruso are really, in his opinion, the two people on the planet who are the top specialists in the Galilean dialect of Aramaic, and that basically when they, in their scholarship where they reconstruct an early, hypothetical source behind the Gospel of John that they say was in Galilean Aramaic and then translated by Papias into Greek. I think that's their theory, and then Jacob may correct me because he may understand the theory better than I do. That basically when they make claims about what that underlying text said, how it's supposed to be interpreted, how it should be vocalized, and drawing their interpretation from their reconstruction of the text and their vocalization of the text, that basically any criticisms by peers of that scholarship that are coming from people trained in the Eastern dialects that are, Syriac scholars, that basically they're totally out of their element, and that they are effectively in this bubble where they're beyond reproach. And that is something, I'll like I said, I'll punt it to Jacob to maybe elaborate on what he wanted to get out of this conversation with respect to that, because in attempting to vet these claims, we're faced with the sort of proposition that nobody can vet those claims because it's outside of everyone's expertise except these two people. Jacob, do you have anything to add to that in terms of what you were hoping to kind of clarify in this conversation? Because this was one of the motivating factors of reaching out to you and getting your opinion on this.
Yeah. I think I don't remember completely, but I think he's working. Oh, yeah, actually, no, he did say this. Yes, he is working from a couple of physical texts, and I think one of them is the Crawford Codex, Palestinian lectionaries. It was something along those lines, but he did mention something about Palestinian lectionaries that he utilized to reconstruct the Galilean Aramaic Gospel of John, that he thinks preceded canonical John.
Mm.
So that's basically what he's saying, and that and he thinks that the Galilean Aramaic John that he's reconstructed dates back to the 1st century.
Okay. My response to this is that certainly he and his colleague, the other gentleman
Steve
that you
Caruso.
mentioned, that's right, Caruso, are correct in the complaint, maybe I could attribute to them or whatever, that Syriac scholars are going to be clueless about this. And are in fact, and are look askance at this kind of thing. And I would want to say that any attempt to translate or to reconstruct the Greek, let's say, of the Gospel of John back into a Galilean idiom is a great enterprise. I want to think you have to have a lot of specialism in order to do that with any precision whatsoever. And I think this is terrific. And the Gospel of John, the language, the Greek, even lends itself to this kind of back translation, if we can call it that. There's a lot to that. And I think in some places of the Gospel of John, it would work a lot better than in others. For example, the prologue would make beautiful sense there to do it. But the enterprise should not be confused with origin. I have trouble thinking that the gospel as a whole can be thought to have originated in this kind of Galilean Aramaic. I'm sure that in a staccato way, there are going to be places where this might illustrate the text very beautifully. The point of being lifted up as a servant or being crucified, that's the same word. And it's in Syriac, at least, it's something that works. Is it Zalaf, whatever, which we have in the Gospel of John. I mean, things like that. It would make very good sense, and it's terrific to play with a hypothesis of this sort. But to make a historical claim, to couple the enterprise with a historical claim about an original, I think is wrong-footed.
But what would you say about the idea that basically what I'm curious about is like when we see this breakdown, right? We have to assume that there are, like, for Palmyrene Aramaic, we have an inscription there, right? For Nabatean, we have an inscription. What inscriptions do we have for the Galilean dialect of Aramaic, and then maybe its parent dialect, the Jewish Palestinian and Christian Palestinian? If the claim is that we're able to reconstruct a Gospel of John in the Galilean dialect of Aramaic in particular, what manuscripts would a project like that be able to draw from?
Late manuscripts.
Okay.
It's 6th, 7th century later. And this is precisely the same problem that we have with the Targumic approaches to the Gospels. We're dealing with substantially later texts. It doesn't mean that it's totally irrelevant. That would be wrong. Klaus Bayer, even my teacher, in his book, The Aramäischen Texte vom Toten Meer, the Aramaic texts from the Dead Sea, includes some later inscriptions from Galilean and so forth Aramaic, but they are later, just to illustrate that the later evidence isn't completely irrelevant for thinking about the Second Temple period in which Jesus lived and worked and so forth. But to go a further step and to take a running text and to do this is, I think, it's more wishful thinking. But I wouldn't say at the same time that it's non-scholarly. It is scholarly, and it's a beautiful thing to be able to do. Even Maurice Casey tried to do that with Q and the Gospel of Mark and so forth. His results were hardly historical, but it did illustrate to some degree that he knew a bit of Aramaic from a particular, context, even if that Aramaic wasn't so relevant.
But sorry, go ahead.
Go on. Mm-hmm.
If the project is to reconstruct the Gospel of John in the Galilean dialect, and you're saying that the only texts you have to work with for such a reconstruction are late, potentially like in this family right here, right? 4th century, 5th century, 6th century. For example, Syriac Sinaiticus, right? I think Dr. Odlin mentioned that he works with this manuscript, but could you explain the textual or linguistic character of this particular manuscript, of the underlying text of the palimpsest?
Well, the palimpsest, it's a really important one. And it's also very early. I think it's late 4th century?
Yeah.
I'm not exactly sure, but it's a translation from Greek. And it's very difficult when you're taking a language in its literary form and then projecting that, back into a language of composition. I think that's very, very tenuous. And so, I congratulate that effort, but I don't think that the historical motivation there is on the right track. I think it's beautiful to encounter the Gospels. I work a lot in Ethiopic, so in the Ethiopic language, and I am very moved by what I see in Ethiopic New Testament. But I know it has nothing to do with the 1st century, let alone with the 4th century when it was initially being translated into Ethiopic. It's no pretend.
Because if I recall, when I was trying to find, okay, what are the manuscripts that we have that represent the Galilean dialect, I was coming up with like tax receipts and things like that. I don't know. Do you know off the top of your head what material we have to work with to reconstruct that form of the language?
Okay, I would say the Midrash Rabbah, the Genesis Rabbah, Bereshit Rabbah, which is an interpretation of Genesis.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have further Midrashim, which are bilingual, by the way. They are, part Hebrew, and then it breaks into Aramaic almost seamlessly, and then comes back. This probably gives us our most important running texts for Galilean Aramaic, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And you're right. And it's these little legal documents and smaller bits that Klaus Bayer then includes, some of which he includes in his treatment of the Aramaic text from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and even includes in his lexicon, because he sees them as relevant for that period.
Well, I have a final question to satisfy my curiosity about this. One of the things that I found interesting about Dr. Odlin's work is that he mentioned that because the vocalization of Syriac happened so late, and the manuscripts for Syriac are so late, that there is a sort of canonical vocalization that's considered standard that Syriac scholars defer to say, like, this is the way we need to vocalize this text. And for people who don't know what I'm talking about, it's that these are abjads with consonants. We don't know exactly what vowels are inserted, and sometimes if you insert one vowel, a word can have one meaning, and if you insert a different vowel, a word can have another meaning. And I think the thing to keep in mind is that the author probably had a specific vocalization in mind when he wrote it. And then looking back, you have to kind of figure out, well, what did the author mean by this cluster of consonants, right? And what Dr. Odlin was saying was that in his work, because he's reconstructing the text in the Galilean dialect in particular, that he can't import assumptions into his work based on the vocalization of Syriac, because that would be anachronistic. And he says that when he chooses a vocalization of a text, if he reconstructs a text and then creates a vocalization for it and then gets a certain meaning from that in his translation, when it gets contested by people based on vocalization of Syriac, that is not valid criticism.
He's absolutely right. It isn't valid criticism. He's absolutely right. There is a big difference, a fundamental difference between this Syriac Eastern Aramaic and the kind of Western Aramaic with which he engaged. Absolutely true. It's just that the problems of the approach to the first century are not eliminated by that. His criticism may be right in one direction, and he may be right that we have here a Western form of Aramaic that would be closer to what we can plausibly imagine to have been spoken in Judea, Palestine in the first century, let alone Jesus, but by the writer of the Gospel of John. But he is still dealing with a big anachronism. I'm sure that I know and we see that in rabbinic literature, that there was a known distinction between Judean Aramaic and Galilean Aramaic. Mm-hmm. It's clear. But these distinctions are discussed much later, and we don't know how long into a previous period this can be projected. We really don't know. So Fitzmyer's caution that we should take the Dead Sea Scrolls Aramaic as a point of departure is not to be ignored. But even though, these are manuscripts copied and transmitted in that context as well, and are closer and more contemporary to the time.
But when you say what we have here, to clarify, you're referring to the Gospel of John in Galilean Aramaic dialect. Does that exist outside of a theoretical reconstruction? Are there manuscripts that have pieces of it? Does it exist outside of this project?
I can't answer that. I don't know. If so, not as a running text.
Got it.
I think that's fairly clear, and it's a matter of reconstruction here. Good. The Syriac, that's easy to blow out of the water, this kind of criticism. Yes, there are established ways of pronouncing things, and we've talked about kum and kumi. Well, kum would be the Syriac of pronouncing it, not kumi. Good. It's easy to blow that out of the water, but the Galilean has its own big problem, and I think any simplistic solution towards determining an original Vorlage, back to that word, behind the Greek of the Gospels, is going to run into serious trouble at one stage or another. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, I think this particular attempt is again wrong-footed. But to translate the Greek or to even try to reconstruct an Aramaic out of that is a brilliant exercise in language and could lead to insights.
Now, if
And
it were, to my point about vocalization, if it were reconstructed in retroactively in this Galilean dialect based on older witnesses, right? And you had a purely consonantal text, is it true to say that in any given verse that you could basically create, depending on how you vocalize it, it could mean like 10 different things, and we just don't know, like how reliably could a text like that be vocalized to restore what the author originally intended, as opposed to just being this like whack-a-mole like spectrum of meanings that, because like I'm somewhat familiar with how vocalization works in Hebrew, at least. And it's like, it seems to me like you tend to narrow in on what is a reasonable, there are nonsensical readings that you can throw out the window, and narrow in on basically like only a few variants of what the text would reliably be reconstructed as. But I think that what Dr. Odlin's emphasis was that in any given verse that he's working with, because he's not taking the Syriac vocalization as an axiom, he's like, it could mean anything, and therefore, like, I could translate it in 10 different ways. Like I don't, how much ambiguity is there really in the vocalization of these texts?
There is certainly a lot of ambiguity if we're taking the orthographies of Dead Sea Scrolls, let's say, into account. What's interesting about the later texts, and this is why we can clearly see in them dialects, is that vocalizations are introduced, but they're not the kind of vocalizations that are different symbols above and below the consonants.
Mm-hmm.
Rather, these are vocalizations introduced by other consonants, which can have vowel values, like a yod being for an e, and a hey or an aleph being for an ah sound. And they can be inserted into words, or a wow for an o or a u. And they can be inserted, and they are distinct enough in the later materials and in the later evidence that one can really make out a kind of vocalization.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the basis of this, to possibly then make claims about its early use in these dialectical forms. But certainly he is absolutely correct that we cannot transplant a Syriac vocalization into the Aramaic of the first century.
Okay. And then I guess if I could slip in one final question, and then I'll zip it and close out to Jacob. So here in the preamble, right? And archi no logos, και ο λόγος in prostontheon, και ο Theos in o logos. I know that there are competing views on this particular verse in the preamble, right? Like where logos is considered to be a Greek philosophical idea, right? The sort as reason, the word that God spoke, that is also in Philo, is some kind of a divine agent, and is an angelic being, and there's a lot behind that. But there's also an idea that this might go back to an Aramaic concept of word. And do you have any insights on this sort of debate?
I'm more clued up on the Hellenistic Philonic side of the debate, but I do want to say that it has come into play amongst the Targumic approach people, Robert Hayward being one scholar, who have studied the Targum Neophyte very closely. And what's interesting here is that the word memra, which means word, for the Hebrew Bible, in the Aramaic translations of the Hebrew Bible, is increasingly introduced into parts of the text, let's say in the Pentateuch, in which God is seen to be active.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just God, it's the Word of God, or the Word. And so the Targumic tradition, maybe this is early. Of course, we've said that this particular manuscript, I've got photographs of it behind me, represents God's activity as, Word.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if this is pre-Christian, that's very, very interesting.
Yeah.
If it is a response to Christian tradition at a later time, it's also very, very interesting. And I would tend to see that as being more operative than it being pre-Christian. So when I'm thinking of the Aramaic side to this, I automatically think of Targum Neophiti, and this particular side of the conversation. Robert Hayward I think it's his dissertation under Geza Vermesh on the Memra of the Targum,
Mm-hmm.
and doesn't focus on the Gospel of John, but in looking at the use of Memra in the Targums, I found very enlightening.
Does that create a different, because here you have obviously like all things came into being through this word, through this logos, right? And without him, not one thing, like not one thing came into being without him. This is a divine agent of creation, right? In the Philonic sense, because Philo in Confusion of Tongues calls the word the firstborn of God, right? There's just so much overlap there. So, are you saying that from that Aramaic side, it coincides with this, or does it give another dimension to it that's not what we see in Philo?
I think the other dimension, if anything, that is the frequency with which it recurs.
Uh-huh.
Philo doesn't use logos all over the place. He introduces poignant parts of his discussion of the Jewish scriptures, and then zeroes in on it and discusses it. Probably what's more relevant here than the word is actually the concepts of wisdom that are in play. And here the semantics is one thing, and the idea may be a slightly different, and they dovetail together in this particularly beautiful text at the beginning of the Gospel of John.
Yeah. All right. Well, Jacob, I apologize for really commentary. I know Jacob and I had an arrangement where I was going to really spearhead this. That's why he really wanted me on, because it's it's something that there's so many things that you shed light on. So thank you so much for coming on and for agreeing to and thank you, Jacob, for letting me ask all of my questions and really just have a wonderful Saturday morning picking your brain on this. It's a real honor. Thank you both for allowing me to do this.
Thank you for having me. It's been fun, and you've given me some new things to think about also, and very grateful to you, Jacob, and also Stephen.
And I want to just tell everybody real quick that I have the links to purchase Dr. Loren Stuckenbruck's books in the description below, and also the link to the Cross Bible website. Stephen Nelson's website will be provided in the description below and in the pinned comment as well. That being said, Loren, thank you very much for joining me today, and Stephen Nelson. This was a wonderful discussion.
All right, thank you both.
Have a great weekend.
You too.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.